if you're stepping into a situation that's broken or there's areas about it that are really difficult to deal with, it's likely God is bringing you into a situation not just for you to help them, but for it
Mm.
to help you. Like there's probably something about you that he wants to do, that he wants to address, that he wants to reveal. And I found that to be true in me. And I can look back now and go, oh man, I'm a different person. I'm a far different leader because I had to get healthier in order to
Mm.
even do the work.
Hey, thanks so much for checking out this video. The Canadian Church Leaders Network is all about seeding a hopeful future for the church in Canada by coming alongside pastors to serve, connect, and resource them as they go out and do the same for their communities. That's the vision. So if you're looking to be further resourced, connect with more church leaders across the country, or hear incredible stories of God's faithfulness in the church in Canada, follow us on Instagram by searching CCLN, visit ccln.ca, or subscribe to our channel below. Thanks again for watching this video. Have a good one.
Jeff, it's really a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks for making time to spend with us.
Yeah, it's good to be with you.
I'd love to hear a little bit, in your universe, what is capturing your imagination, your creativity, your time? Like, what are you most excited that you're giving yourself to these days?
I think it's a few things. I think one, I've been helping churches redesign their whole disciple making strategy. I think post COVID, everyone's realizing that we need to probably rethink a lot. And
Mm.
so we've designed a new offering called the Disciple Making Lab, where we take churches through a 1-year journey of redesigning their whole disciple making strategy. And so we're doing it in Tokyo, probably going
Mm.
to start doing it in the UK, doing it across the United States. So that one I'm really excited about, because helping leaders think through what is the core of what they're trying to do, which is make disciples who make disciples and do it well, has been really exciting to see light bulbs go on, to see movements start to take place. And in fact, one of my most favorite moments was seeing a church that's well over 100 years old, led largely by people in their 60s and 70s, all of a sudden just get super excited about
Mm.
disciple making and see movement start to happen again, and think, man, it doesn't matter the age of the church or the style of the church, the background of the church. Like, we all can get back to what Jesus
Mm.
commanded, and we can do it well. So I think that's the first, but not first, but it's one of the things that's capturing my attention and imagination. The other is really helping people step into some of the new learning that we're doing around brain science. And if you're interested, I'll share a little bit more about like
Yeah, I
what
love
Dallas
that.
Willard discovered toward the end of his life around attachment-based disciple making and formation, and just seeing how that is significantly shifting some of the ways in which some of us are thinking about
Mm.
the ways in which we're creating experiences and spaces for disciple making. So those are probably two of the more exciting spaces I'm in right now.
Mm. One of the themes, or I have a theory, one of the things that you've done as a gift is you've taken words we use a lot, like the gospel, disciples, and you've gone, what if we actually defined it? I think it was Willard that used to like say something to the effect of like, he wanted to have an assault on vagueness. Like he felt like vague words was a disservice to our discipleship. I think you've kind of whether you responded to Willard's call or it was just your own conviction, I don't know, but you've kind of gone, well, what is a disciple, or what is the gospel, and what does it mean today? You've brought it to the ground. And when it comes to
Hmm.
this idea of discipleship, and this is a bit of a prefacing question, but I'd love to know, why do you think something that's so essential, like as pastors, we know we make disciples, the Great Commission, we know this is like such an essential word and component of the Christian faith. Why do you think it's remained so vague and kind of obtuse for so long? Like we find ourselves saying things like, well, are we an evangelistic Sunday or discipleship? Like, and we say these things, we're like, we don't even, it stayed so vague, and we can find ourselves being like, I don't really know how to make a disciple today. It's like the main thing we do. I'm just curious how you've made sense of why this remains such a challenge to even define the term and do the thing that's kind of the main thing.
Well, before I answer the question, I just got off a call with a church, a group of elders from a church, and they were talking about wanting to hire a discipleship pastor, and they're concerned about how the other staff are not going to be able to work with a new discipleship pastor, and how do they do all this? Because I said it's kind of weird that we would hire a discipleship pastor when the entire focus of the whole church is just supposed to be disciple making, and yet we call it a category as though it's a sidebar or
Yeah.
sideshow to the church. So I'll just preface it saying, like, I think in some ways there's a lot of ways to answer your question. I think the first one I would say is it's potentially demonic. Like, let's just say it, like if the evil one were to want to like stop what Jesus gave us, he would get us distracted on everything but the thing that Jesus told us to do. So
Mm,
like I wonder if there isn't some kind of deception or I mean honestly, like I use the word demonic, but what I mean by that is just to say like there's something terribly broken when the very last words of Jesus aren't the first words in our mind when we think about what we're doing. So
yeah.
like where is that? How did that happen? Like that sounds like, Genesis 3, I know God
Mm,
said this, but what he really meant was this type of
mm,
thing. Like he knows there's another thing. So it's like he questioned the very word. That just feels at the heart of it almost like so subversive of the evil one to do that. But I think there are some other ways that we could also answer it. One is I think we created curriculum around themes like evangelism, discipleship, and then we create quickly, books around leadership and around church, and all those seem to like segment the
mm,
concept instead of holistically address the concept of it's all disciple making. It's all about discipleship. So I think that may be it. I also think you do what's celebrated.
mm,
And I think especially through the church growth movement in the 80s, 90s, and the turn of the century, what got celebrated is, the fastest growing church, the large church, and so we started celebrating certain kinds of things. And then whenever you celebrate, you move toward that, you work toward that. So then it's like, well, how do we become big too? And how do we
mm,
grow too? And then what I think you start to do is you do whatever it takes to get the end game accomplished. And you can actually grow a crowd and never make disciples. And we all know how to do it. Like we all know the way to pull it off. We know how to grow your church bigger. And so if the end game is that, then you can sacrifice disciple making. In fact, I would say you have to probably sacrifice
mm,
disciple making in order to get that. Because, if Jesus wanted that, he just would have catered to the crowds. He
mm,
didn't do that. In fact, I was just interacting with some guys today. I said, I'm paying attention more and more in the Gospels. There were no disciples in the crowds, and there were no disciples in the religious leaders, which makes me wonder today, do we have disciples in the crowds, and are religious leaders actually disciples? Or are they more like
mm,
what Jesus ran into, which is the crowds wanted miracles, they wanted more food, they were there to get something primarily from Jesus. They weren't there to follow Jesus. And leaders were there to have authority and power to get the crowd for themselves. And I just wonder, are we in the same place today where we're like, we like the crowd and we like authority and position, but we don't actually like the work of making disciples?
mm,
And if you look at Jesus, he didn't have very many disciples. And he was okay with that. And that's the question. I
yeah.
think that might be the third thing I would ask is, does our ego fight against the very work of disciple making because it's slow, it's not impressive, it's very messy, it's hard to like make a big deal about because like
Hmm.
you just can only make so many at a time. So I don't know if the third part of it is that maybe our ego needs to be addressed here and say like, why did we get into this in the first place?
Mm.
Was it something other than that? And again, maybe the church growth movement, I think it had good intentions, but I think some of what it produced, what we're living with today, and maybe that's some of what we need to repent of.
I really appreciate those reflections. I want to go deeper into a lot of those themes. Maybe before we do, could you give me a flyover of your sort of ministry journey? Like what pulled you into it? And what I really love and admire about you and your story is you've you've served in different capacities in different churches, and all along the way though you've been giving a lot of it away. Like I think there's a deep value expressed in your life. Like I want to give this away to other pastors and say what
Hmm.
are we learning here that can be given away, and I've benefited from that personally. But go as far back as you want, but I'd love to hear sort of some of the early days that pulled you into it. It's a big decision to say, I want to be a pastor. It's not a casual thing. And then some of the different sort of formative experiences along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't a casual thing. I was originally on the track to like my undergrad is business. That's what I got my major in. And then I was planning on going to the University of Michigan for law school.
Mm,
So I was going to get into business law. That was my original track. And then God broke in my junior year of college and got a hold of my life, and I surrendered everything to Jesus, and I'll do whatever you want, go wherever you want. And that happened to be a youth camp that he led me to in Pennsylvania called Summer's Best 2 Weeks. I realized I had a gift. I would say now I realize I had an evangelism. I had a gift of evangelism, or no, I was an evangelist. I'll say it that way. Ephesians 4. I am given to the church as an evangelist. I also am an apostle type. That's who I am. I didn't
Yeah.
know that back then. We didn't even use that language back then. But I was seeing kids come to Christ, and I'm like, I got to do something with this. I got into youth ministry out in Seattle, very traditional Christian Reformed church that was completely ingrown. And yet, over the years, we saw the youth ministry grow larger than the church and had a significant impact of reaching many, many kids for Jesus. And I kept equipping students to become disciple makers. That I think was always in the heart of what I was called to
Mm.
do. When I became the first book I read after I became a follower of Jesus was The Master Plan of Evangelism by Robert E. Coleman. So like I was just like, okay, that's just what you do, right? When you follow Jesus, you're a disciple, and a disciple makes disciples. I didn't know of another kind of Christian when I became a Christian.
Mm.
So I just thought, well, if you're going to youth ministry, your job is not to run programs for youth. Your job is to equip youth for disciple making. And so that's what I did. Eventually did it at a bigger church in Chicago, and then a church that many probably know of is Willow Creek. Worked at a very large church and helped do that in that context, but was fairly disillusioned, frankly, because
Mm.
I would watch students graduate into what they called big church, and often they were encouraged, take a seat, invite a friend, give your money. Oh, and by the way, it'd be nice if you served in something like children's ministry or be a greeter or whatever. And I just watched, it was like they were deflated after that. I was like,
Mm.
really? Like we were on the front lines. It's kind of like someone who played, sports competitively and now they don't even get to coach. They just have to sit and watch in the stands,
Mm.
That's kind of what it felt like as I watched these students just kind of take a seat. And many of them didn't. They just said, I'm going to leave and go do something. And they're all over the world to this day doing great work. But that led me to be disillusioned. I was almost ready to leave and go back to
Mm.
business because I thought, well, maybe we could do more in the business world than we can in the church world. Because everybody who's in the marketplace knows that, gosh, this is my life, and hopefully I can learn how to make a disciple in this context. But the Lord had different plans, and He led me to go back to Seattle to plant. The first church that I planted was called Soma. That
Mm.
was in Tacoma, Washington, and we just
What
said,
year about is that?
that's 2003 when I
Okay,
moved
where's the
back.
church planting movement at that point? Like, because there's
It's
a real
just
wave.
Yeah, it started right at the end of the like the late 90s was when it really started to get to be pretty popular.
Mm.
I don't think up until then, and I should back up because you talked about sharing everything I'd been given. When I was at Willow, I kept saying, "Hey, we're a rich church. We've got so many resources. Let's just give away everything we can." So I let all the churches know I've got more than enough students trained to lead worship, musical
Mm.
worship, or to to even teach if you want. Like we've been training these students to do this. So if you're ever lacking in your context, we're willing to give our teams away. And so we had several traveling like worship teams made up of students that would go to other churches and serve their youth ministry. And that
Mm.
was
I
just kind
love
of how
that.
I worked. And what we were doing at the Next Gen with Nancy Ortberg and some others who were leading that ministry, they were seeing a thing go out into Chicagoland through house groups, which is really an extension of what we were also doing in the youth ministry. So we were seeing this beginning growth of what could
Mm.
be a big C church movement in Chicago. And sadly, with the building of a brand new building, and I don't say this to discount the ways Bill Hybels was a great influence in my life. There's really good things I did receive at Willow from him, but he wanted to bring it all back to the building and wanted to
Mm.
shut down anything that was going out as an extension because I think he anticipated this could become a multiplicity of many churches getting started. And if you know of Bill's past, he didn't really want more church planting. He wanted to strengthen the already existing churches, and so it kind of shut down what I felt like could have been a movement. I share
Mm.
that because I think when we started Soma, we said we want to lead a church in such a way that it becomes normative that every disciple, every follower of Jesus is a disciple who makes disciples. And if they're here long enough, they should be able to go anywhere in the world and start a new church. at least
Mm.
be the, part of a core team of a new church startup. And or if they left our church and went to another church, it would make those churches stronger. And we would want to just be a church that's just ready to have open hands. We want the whole region reached for the sake of Jesus. So we don't care if they're in our kind of expression or some other expression of the church. We just want the church to grow as a whole in the region. And so that, I think, led to the generosity of spirit of let's give everything away. Let's give
Mm.
people away. None of it is ours. We want to see the whole city reached. We want to see the whole country, the whole world reached. So whenever people leave for the sake of bringing the gospel somewhere else, we're going to celebrate it. It's because they're never
Mm.
ours. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to Soma. They're Jesus's people. So I think
Mm.
experiencing some of the opposite of that at Willow in terms of bringing it all back probably led me to go, I want to lead in a different way than that. Even though I got to taste some of it at Willow because we did give away a lot, but I
Mm-hmm.
watched it change at one point. And I think this can happen to all leaders is we can get nervous that if we lose too many people, we'll lose resources. If we lose resources, how are we going to sustain what we have? And I
Mm.
think that's a temptation that regardless of the size of church you are, like everybody struggles with that
Yeah.
kind of ready to release mentality. It's like people
Yeah.
who raise up kids and then those kids help run the farm. What if those kids go off and start their own farm? Who's going to run the farm at home? I think
Yeah.
that's kind of how we feel about the church.
I had an interesting, I saw something in my heart like a month or two ago. And it was like, so we planted maybe 3 years ago. And in some ways, there's no like clear thresholds, but we passed that threshold of like, we're hustling to see if this thing will, like, is anyone coming? Like, we're past that. And I had this moment of like, that kind of feels nice. Like, oh, I wonder if now we can settle in. Like this year end, I didn't know if I wasn't like, are we going to die or not? Like, do you know what I mean? Like it's
Yeah.
our first
Yeah.
year. And something in my heart, it was an interesting thing. It's like, every once in a while by God's grace, you can see like you're like inside, like see what you're thinking. And I remember being like chatting it through with some of the team members that we pastor together with. And I was like, we need to keep that desperate, open-handed,
Mhm.
we're trying to play our part in the kingdom perspective, because there was this little temptation that was just a little voice that actually sounded really nice. That was like, what if we just like simplify, protect a little bit, build this thing up, make it easy? And that, undermines a lot of gospel impulse, including that sending, including
Yeah.
that open-handedness, including that desperation on the work of the Spirit. And but it
Mhm.
was helpful for me to see it, because I was like, oh, this isn't just something that big mega churches feel tempted about. This is something that kind of sits in our heart that just goes, what if, it's fear or whatever it is. And so I really appreciate you sharing that. And as you're sharing also, I was just struck by this idea of like the impulse of the church has always been ascending people. And I think
Yeah.
if we end up losing that impulse, we probably actually, there's probably something we let go of that's actually so much more essential to our gospel identity, or our church, like what it means to be the people of Jesus. And it was just from the beginning ascending people, which is, I remember actually one time it was you were in Vancouver and you were talking about missional communities. And you just mentioned how sad it was and how joyful it is when you release and you multiply. And I never forgot the way you talked about the joy, and a bit, not, I don't know if you use the word pain, but like, it's really sad seeing people
It
go. These are my
is.
friends. We
Yep.
did years together. The cost and joy of sending.
Yeah. I've likened it these days to a combination of well, like almost like a wedding, right? So I have two daughters, one son. I anticipate the day when I'm going to be giving my daughters away, to somebody in marriage. And I will probably bawl like a baby because it's the end of a season and I have to say goodbye, and celebrate because Lord willing, and our oldest daughter is dating a really wonderful godly man who we think they're probably going to get married. They're talking about it. And so like I have so much joy thinking about her being with a man who loves Jesus, them getting to start a new family, us, if the Lord gives, having grandkids. Like all that is both sad and celebratory at the same time. And
Mm,
I really think that's what the kingdom of God does feel like. It's the blessed are those who mourn, they'll be comforted, and there's much joy in our sadness. Like it's
mm,
the two at the same time. And I think we're trying so hard, it seems, in the church to avoid pain. that I think we actually miss the blessedness that Jesus promises in his preaching of the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. And so it's like,
Mm,
I think we want the blessed, but we don't want the pain. And I don't think you get the pain or the blessed without the pain. Like
yeah.
it comes through suffering, it comes through loss. And the reason why is I think it's because it's in those moments that we experience a fellowship of Christ's suffering, that
Mm,
he was willing to suffer, he was willing to lose, he was willing to give up so that we might have. And in the end, he received it all back. And so, yeah, I think that's at the heart of what we've got to learn to embrace, which makes us really free because then the only thing we grasp onto is him, and
mm,
everything else we can release, you know. So, in fact, I had to learn to do that. I didn't tell the rest of my story. The Soma family grew out of one church that became multiple churches, and now it's global. It's all over the world. And then I got called to step into what was Mars Hill, Bellevue, when everything blew up there in 2014, and
mm.
restart a church out of that context called Doxa, and to leave Soma, which
Yeah.
still to this day is the richest church experience I've ever had in my life. Like it, I don't know if we'll ever get anything like it again, which is fine, but it was the richest we've ever had. My wife and I still look back on those days and think we've never tasted
Mm,
what felt so close to what his disciples got to experience with him as what we did in those days. And we had to step into a situation that was really painful, really hard, leave our friends, leave our kids had to leave their best friends, like significant loss familially,
mm,
to come into a very broken place and be ridiculed. I was ridiculed by many friends. People across the country wrote about it. Like it's just wasn't, there was nothing good about
mm,
stepping into that from most people's perspective. And yet then we learned how to lose again. We learned how to suffer again. We learned how to give away again. And there's a beautiful church in place now, thankfully, because of that. I'm no longer leading that. Now I'm leading a little group of believers and non-Christians yet, hopefully that will come to faith in our home in kind of a micro church expression. So it just, we continue to release and be sent.
mm,
And I think that generosity of spirit and the embracing of loss is, I think, the way of the kingdom. And
mm,
so, and I don't do that to boast. I think that the Lord's been leading and I've been learning, and I'm still learning how to live this way. So,
mm. I really appreciate that. Stepping into a church, the Mars Hill Bellevue, so much pain, so many people likely skeptical of any authority structure, so wounded, probably toxic expression. And then I'm sure also a ton of beautiful disciples. They're sticking it out, like they love Jesus. What did you learn through that process? Like there's so many pastors listening who have inherited a church that has some beautiful parts of their culture and then maybe unhealth and pain and brokenness. And sometimes I feel like we don't have a toolkit to kind of begin the work of healing the heart of the community and then bringing in a culture that better reflects the kingdom. What are some learnings that you have or some practices that you might pass on to people in similar situations?
well, there's one thing that I wish I would have done differently, and that is I wish I would have sought a lot more counsel from people like a Chuck DeGrout or, um, well, gosh, just my mind is escaping me, but there's several people who live in the space of dealing with toxicity in church
Mm,
leadership that I would have probably said, will you come in and give me your eyes, give me your perspective on what you see. I think I was a little, I probably would say, I have to say I was probably arrogant. And I don't mean that in like I was coming in like, I'm going to change everything. But looking
yeah.
at it now, it's like, I think arrogance can just show up in the fact that you don't realize you need more wisdom than you have in yourself. That's another form of arrogance, right? And so I think I would have done well to have brought in more perspectives on the situation and on me too, frankly, because one thing I didn't know is I didn't know I also was unhealthy.
Mm,
That there was emotional unhealth that I didn't know about in me, and even ways of leading that were not altogether healthy in my own being. And so that got revealed over time because not only did the toxicity of the culture really have a huge impact on me and our
yeah.
family, but it also, my own brokenness had to be revealed in the midst of it too, which I'm
Mm.
grateful for because it, I guess I would say as a side note, if you're stepping into a situation that's broken or there's areas about it that are really difficult to deal with, it's likely God is bringing you into a situation not just for you to help them, but for
Mm.
it to help you. Like there's probably something about you that he wants to do, that he wants to address, that he wants to reveal. And I found that to be true in me. And I can look back now and go, oh man, I'm a different person. I'm a far different leader because I had to get healthier in order to
Mm.
even do the work. And so I think that'd be one of my learning is bring more voices in. Don't be afraid to let people look at what you can't see and tell you what you can't see. I think sometimes our ego has a hard time admitting that we have a limitation of sight or a limitation of experience. So I'd say like walk humbly, invite counsel around you, get objective perspective. The other thing is learn to love the one you've been given instead of love the
Mm.
one you wish who you wish they were. And so that was a learning for me. I remember at one point the Lord said, you basically adopted an 18-year-old, right? That's how old Mars Hill was. And you want her to become like Soma, but
Mm.
she's not Soma. She's post Mars Hill. She's now Doxa. And when you adopt a kid, if anybody knows anything about this, you have to adopt their family of origin. You adopt the things that form them. Like whether you like it or not, it's who they are. And
Mm.
some can get changed and some can get, restored or, healed, but you still adopted somebody who was raised by somebody else. And so I had to get to a place where I just said, Lord, help me to love Doxa for who she is instead of who I want her to be. And that when I got to that place, that was a big breakthrough for me because then I realized I don't have to keep trying to make her somebody else. I want to
Mm.
love her for who she is. Yes, help her get healing. Yes, help restoration happen. Yes, help her continue to move towards Christ likeness, but walk at the pace of love, which is the pace of relationship, which I would say is the pace of the spirit. And I wanted to
Mm.
walk at the pace of Jeff. I want her to become somebody I wanted her to become at my pace. And the Lord really taught me to let it be his pace and to love her for who she is, no matter if she changes or not. So that was a
Mm.
big thing. And then also to embrace what was really beautiful, about what was in the Mars Hill experience. There was a lot of beauty there. There was a lot to be redeemed. And so to be able to say what was right and what was beautiful, and what can we redeem, and let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, which that was some of the work I had to do with people who were deeply wounded, is they wanted to throw it all out. Like,
Yeah.
was my faith even real? Was Jesus ever real? Like, there's a lot of people who walked away from the faith because they rejected all of it instead of saying, no, we started to worship a man other than Jesus. We lifted Mark up too high in our own hearts. And that's not Mark's fault. That's in everybody's own heart. He might have played to that as well. But like, we lifted someone up too high. That person failed us in some way or another, which they always will. And then we rejected everything. It's like, no, 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 don't
Mm.
reject Jesus because of our own idolatry or because of a way a man is human like everybody else. Like, let's hold on to Jesus because he's still the one that remains. And so helping people to do that was a lot of the work we had to do, is like, don't throw out what you have because of the things that maybe are broken around it.
Mm.
So that was a lot of work. And then I had to learn how to sit on people as well who were really angry, really full of, resentment. I had to have an empathy why. I get it. I understand why they were hurting and really, really angry and raging at me. But I'd have to sit on the other side of them and receive a lot of stuff that I did. It wasn't me who did it to them,
Mhm.
but I was the guy still there.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, people would cuss me out and tell me how much they hated me. And I mean, it was a lot of vitriol.
Mhm.
And I had to just learn not to make that personal. Like that
Yeah.
wasn't about me. And then even when as people would leave the church because I wasn't the same and I didn't do it the same way, to also not make that about me, not to take that personally. And I'd say like to all pastors, I know it still hurts when people leave and it hurts when people hurt you, and don't pretend like it doesn't. That's not what I don't want you to hear me saying that. what I do want to say is, don't make it so about you that everything is a personal offense.
Right.
And that's where we have to watch ourselves, because we make it so about ourselves that if someone doesn't stay or someone doesn't like me, then I make it all about me. And I
Mm,
want to feel pain about that and be honest, that hurts. And I have sadness about that and often feel very lonely because of that. But at the end of the day, I want what's best for people.
yeah.
And if what's best for people is they're somewhere else, then I want to celebrate that. So
Mm,
that was something I had to really learn to do, is be okay with people coming and going, because it wasn't maybe what they needed. And that's not
mm,
anything wrong with me. That's just in God's timing what they need. So yeah, those would be some other things I'd say. And then I think another thing I would say is, if you're stepping into a church that's broken or a situation that's hurting, um, the most important thing is the people. And Paul says to Timothy, 1 Timothy 1:5, the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart and sincere faith. And so if what you do isn't all about love, loving the people you've been given, walking at the pace of love with them, then you're trying to use the people to run your program or build your kingdom and name. And I would say that's going to get you in a lot of trouble, uh,
mm,
because you're called to come and shepherd the flock under the care and place that God's given you, and just do that and let
mm,
God build, let God add, let him at his pace do what he wants to do with those people. And that will probably be the biggest learning from my time at Doxa, is learning that love, the goal is love,
mm,
and everything else is not important if we don't have that.
mm. Um, One of the things I feel like is one of the main questions we keep asking in this podcast and the work we're doing is, it's like, what is a pastor? And it's like we all answer the question like, what do you do for a living or whatever? And depending who we're talking to, maybe with excitement or reluctantly say I'm a pastor. Here in Vancouver, sometimes it's reluctantly I'm a pastor.
Yeah,
Don't leave
yeah,
me.
yeah. Same with
But
Seattle too.
yeah,
It's a
yeah, yeah.
popular thing.
Um, and you've had the opportunity to pastor a church like Willow Creek, to be a church planting pastor, Soma, to be a pastor of pastors through a network of churches, to be part of stepping into an existing church like Doxa, and now um, leading a micro church community in your home. And I'm just curious for some reflections on, what parts of that job description are the same, like that's universal no matter how big or small, and then what is unique in those expressions, and just in this season of life, to look back in these different expressions of pastoral ministry, how you've understood that unique calling you have and then applying it in different contexts.
Well, the word pastors in one language is pastor, in another language is shepherd, right? And so I think at the heart of it, it's shepherding a flock. And we don't do it as the shepherd. Jesus is the chief shepherd. So in a sense, we're under shepherds. So we're extending his shepherding care on his behalf to a body of believers, small or big. And that should never change. There's a
Mm,
sense in which, we're and what does a shepherd do? They're looking over to make sure the flock is safe, watching out for predators, wolves. We're amongst as a fellow sheep. So I think that in Soma we always often say shepherds should smell like sheep
mm,
for two reasons. One, they're amongst the flock, but two, they're one of the flock. And I think that's a thing that gets lost oftentimes. I think on pastors, they don't think that they're one of the sheep, and
mm,
therefore they don't submit themselves to others like we want everyone else to submit themselves to us. And so I think hopefully that doesn't change no matter how big the church is, that you're amongst the flock, that you smell like sheep because you are one and you're amongst them, so that you're humbling yourself regardless of how big the platform or responsibilities God's given you. And then I think you just like any good shepherd, you want to lead them towards the source of life, whether it's, we know that good shepherds led them to water and to good pastures. And so we're constantly not leading them to ourselves. We're leading them to the one who can give them life, which is Jesus, teaching them how to walk in the Spirit and be able to eventually be able to feed others as well. Like that's the goal of every healthy shepherd, is they're raising up more shepherds to oversee, to care for, to lead toward. Um, and then I think as a shepherd in all those contexts that I was in, I think over and over again is to be connected to the chief shepherd in such a way that I'm
Mm,
representing his heart in what I do, in the way that I care for the flock he's given me. And so I regularly am asking, does what I'm doing look like the chief shepherd and how he cares for his flock?
mm,
If it doesn't, then I've lost the whole sense of what it means to be a pastor,
mm,
which is to extend the shepherding care of Jesus in what I do. So I think those are the things that I think of. That includes, of course, instruction and teaching, because we want the flock to know the truth. We want them to be able to be fed. But I would even say this, feeding others based upon what you chewed up is really giving them milk, right? That's what that fundamentally is.
mm,
Like when a mom feeds her baby, she did the chewing, the baby did the drinking. And so I think as a healthy shepherd, I don't want to give milk for too long to people who should be able to eat meat. And eating
mm,
meat is them being able to eat the word themselves and not be overly dependent on me giving it to them.
mm,
And I think one of the things I had to do in each case is don't make sheep so dependent on me that they don't become self-feeders.
mm,
And I think in any context that's possible. It's actually harder to know you're doing it in the larger context, because in the larger context, you don't know if they're becoming self-feeders very well.
right.
In the smaller context, you can know pretty clearly, could these people do this without me? And I think healthy shepherds will lead in such a way that they don't become the kind of the end of the game, but a means to get the sheep, to grow up.
Mm. Um, I'd love to hear a little bit about your most recent book, 180, Return to Disciple Making. Um, Give us a little window in. I know so much of your heart comes through a book like this, and it's not just the writing period. It's really the summation of your life and ministry up to that point. But tell us a little bit about the heart of that and some of the things that you feel was most in your heart to want to give away, to take the time to write and release that.
Yeah, the origin story of that is Dave Ferguson reached out to me. He's the leader of Exponential, and said, "Hey, the theme for Exponential in 2024 is going to be getting back to disciple making." And he
Hmm.
said, "We want to use 5 shifts that we did 10 years ago. We want to reframe it for post-COVID world, and we're wondering if you'd help us just think through the outline." So he gave me the outline, and I had a lot of things I had to say about the outline. I said, "How much do you want me to say?" And he's like, "Share whatever you want." And as I did, he took a lot of notes. He said, "I'm going to send that to you. Would you clean it up and send it back to us? Because we want to make that the outline for the whole conference." So I said, "Yeah," and I did. And then he asked if I'd put it into a book. And
Hmm.
and that's what the book is the culmination of that. So I didn't know I was going to be writing this book
So
until,
you got tricked into writing a book.
yeah, it was like June or July that I realized I had to get a book done by November. And the original framework of these 5 shifts were captured in a book called Discipleship by Jim Putman and Bobby Harrington. And so I want to at least credit the idea of discipleship to them.
Yeah.
But then I took kind of the idea of shifting, and I put new language on it, and I put my content into it from, really, like you said, it's really 33 years of my own ministry life kind of coming together in this moment of saying, if I could put it into one book, what would it look like? And I don't mean it's the whole exhaustive of everything I've ever learned. It's just, what do I think are the basics of building a disciple making culture and getting back to disciple making? And so
Mm,
I wrote it to be not just an intro to the basics, but also a workbook that a team could go through. So in every shift, at the end of it, there's one chapter that's just almost like a workbook for the team that's reading it to work through, what are we going to do in our context in light of what we just read. And so I'm hopeful that it'll be a really helpful tool. In it, there's some new thinking that I'm bringing to the table that I'm writing a lot more on in the coming
mm,
years. And one particular part of that, it's this idea of attachment based disciple making and versus just attendance based.
mm,
Um, and that the goal is not to get people to attend our events or join our programs, but to get them to truly attach to God, to self, and to others
Mm,
in ways that are transformative. And the reason why I'm there in my own journey is because, one, I didn't know how detached I was
mm,
because of my own childhood, my own wounds that I'd never addressed until about 4 years ago. But also, I've been just paying attention to how most of our disciple making efforts are not making Christ-like people. And, Dallas Willard and Jim Wilder were having a conversation, which is captured in the book Renovated, about how after all these years of everything Dallas Willard did on spiritual practices, people were still not very much like Jesus.
mm,
And in his words, Christ-like maturity looks like spontaneous love for the enemy. And he
mm,
would say, in the last 5 years, we've clearly seen most of Christianity is very immature in the way we respond to our enemy. And for us in the United States, different than where you're at, but like you just look at how a Republican Christian and a Democrat Christian relate. It's like literally they don't think either could be Christian, and they
mm,
hate
mhm,
each other, and it's just there's no evidence of the Spirit of Christ in the way that we treat each other. And so Dallas came to the conclusion at the end of his life was that because his wife was a therapist and Jim Wilder considers himself a neural theologian, that people who went through some form of therapy where they learned how to attach relationally in loving ways again and did the spiritual practices, those were the people who grew the most to be most like Christ. And so his conclusion was, if this is eternal life, that they would know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom he sent. And Jesus would pray, Father, as I am in you and you are in me, may they be in us, John 17, so the world would know. Then maybe the whole point of our salvation is to be reattached to God
mm,
in a true loving relationship that's not just knowledge about God, but intimate relational acquaintance with the living God. If that's the goal, that's what salvation is all about, then should all of our disciple making have that as its goal as well? That everything
mm,
is meant to help us experience attachment love with God, attachment with self, because we're disintegrated by sin. So how do we get whole again? And then how do we get healthy attachment with one another, which is what Jesus is meaning when he says, they'll know you're my disciples by your love for
mm,
one another. It's what Paul is saying when he speaks to the church in Philippi, may you have the same mind in you, which, like, in other words, be mindful together, be attached, think together the same thoughts about Christ.
mm,
And so for me now, all of my discipleship thinking is thinking through, does this lead to attachment love with God, attachment with self, and attachment love with others and enemies? And
mm.
so I'm thinking about everything so differently. And the book addresses some of it. It's kind of an intro to the concept, but we're going to write a whole lot more on it because there's a lot to learn.
That's very exciting um, to hear. Um, Maybe as our final question, you get to sit down with a lot of pastors from all over the world, old and young, new to the game, been at it for a while. And I don't think it would be hard for you and I to probably say a few things that are discouraging right now. There's lots of,
Mhm.
we can all
Mhm.
read a Barna stat and be like, oh,
Yeah.
stuff out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's encouraging you? What are you seeing when you're on Zoom calls or in the room with pastors and churches that maybe is strengthening your hope in what God's up to in our time?
Yeah. I think there's a growing realization that humility is the way forward and personal health is the best way to lead.
Hmm.
I'm seeing that, like, even I didn't even talk that much about the whole attachment based stuff, but when I talk about getting healthy, Jesus says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his own soul? And I'm watching, the negative is we've watched pastors lose their
Yeah.
soul, right?
Yeah.
The positive is that pastors are humbling themselves and saying, but by the grace of God, that's going to be me.
Hmm.
So I want to take that seriously. I want to get help. I want to get healthy. I'm presently meeting with 8 pastors. I personally do emotional healthy coaching because I think it's the most important thing your own health is going to lead to the flourishing of everyone else around you. So to see people leaning in, to see the next generation looking forward and going, okay, that's not the pathway I want to take. I want to take a different pathway. I want to take seriously my emotional health. I want to be humble and work in a plurality of leadership. I want to submit myself to others. Like, I'm seeing a growing desire towards those kinds of realities
Yeah.
in leadership. And that gives me a ton of hope, because I will tell you, about 5 or 6 years ago, I was ready to write it off. Like, I was ready to go, like, we're not going to make it. The narcissism, the toxicity, the brokenness, the fallout, it's so massive. And now I'm having great hope, because I'm realizing, like, that's not the norm anymore. Like, I don't think that's the norm going forward. I think we're going to see a new norm. And that gives me a ton of hope, because God's opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And I think if we will humble ourselves under his hand, in due time, he'll lift us up the way he wanted to lift us up. We don't have to lift ourselves up. Let him do that. And so I think there's a growing desire to move in that direction among people your age, frankly, and that gives me a ton of hope, because I'm hopeful that your generation won't repeat the mistakes of my generation.
Well, I'm deeply grateful for the time you've made with us today, and for all that you've given away through your body of work. And yeah, such a gift. Thanks for being with us, man.
Yeah, thank you.
Hey, before you go, we want to let you know about a few things we do here at CCLN that might serve you as you lead yourself and others. First, we have a podcast. The Canadian Church Leaders Podcast features brand new episodes every 2 weeks, featuring conversations with church leader voices from across Canada and the world. We also send out a newsletter to our network every month that contains helpful resources and content that our team curates for pastoral ministry in the Canadian context. If you or your church wants to partner with CCLN in our mission to lift up and serve pastors across Canada, we invite you to consider making a one-time or regular donation. You can do that or find out more at ccln.ca/partner. Thank you so much for watching this video. From myself and the CCLN team, we love you and we are cheering you on.